This is James Corbett of CorbettReport.com with your Sunday update for this 26th day of September 2010. And now for the real news. The UK's Revenue and Customs Agency has proposed that British employers send all employee paychecks directly to the government, which will then deduct whatever tax it deems appropriate before sending the remaining funds to the employee via bank transfer. Today, the majority of employer payrolls are connected to the electronic payment infrastructure, the report reads. Under centralized deductions, the employer would send the gross payment through the electronic payment system to a central calculator where the deductions calculated by HMRC would be made automatically. The resulting net payment would then be sent to the individual's bank account, and the deductions would be paid directly to the government. Even the most ardent government supporters are decrying the proposal, noting that such a system would be rife with possibilities for mistakes, corruption, and vulnerabilities. If HMRC has direct access to employees' bank accounts and makes a mistake, people are going to feel very exposed and vulnerable, said George Bull, head of tax at Baker Tilly, about the proposal. There has to be some very clear understanding of how quickly repayments were made if there was a mistake. Even more worrying than the near certainty of mistakes in such a system, however, is the implicit extension of government control over every aspect of its citizens' lives that such a proposal grants. The UK is already the most surveilled society on the planet, with an estimated 4.5 million CCTV cameras keeping track of citizens' every movement, a £2 billion program for the government to access records of every phone call, every email, every text message, and every website visit made by the public, a program of family intervention projects in which thousands of UK families have been put under 24-hour supervision with CCTV cameras placed by the government inside their own homes to make sure that children attend school and go to bed on time, and pilot programs for citizens to be given access to the CCTV feeds so they can spy on other citizens.
A new program that's been developed in North London, which is called the Shoreditch Digital Bridge Project. And what the local council has done there is given all of its local residents access to all of the CCTV footage live as it's happening through their television. They've got special boxes. So what you have is people bunkered down in their flats and their homes, watching their neighbors and checking out for criminal activity.
I think it poses very difficult questions about human rights, and I think it also poses very difficult questions about the relationship of the state with the citizen, in this case being used as a kind of spy. This is moving down the route that, for example, East Germany had in the 1950s and the 1960s, where eventually 1/6 of the population were police informers of various kinds, keeping watch on other people. I think this is moving towards a state where we have individuals acting on behalf of the state, trying to enforce the goals of the state. This is a very dangerous route to go down.
What all of these steps towards centralized surveillance and control over every aspect of every citizen's lives indicate is the 21st century enactment of an 18th century idea known as the Panopticon.
1787, an architect invented the perfect prison and called it the Panopticon. The prisoners would be seen wherever they were, but would never know if they were being watched. It was designed to control the prisoners using surveillance alone, and was seen as the ultimate power of mind over mind. No Panopticons were ever built, but Tony Blair's most expensive legacy will be to have turned the entire country into a perfect prison. The government wants to put a tracking device in every car on the road. Surveillance cameras are being connected to directional microphones, as well as facial recognition software, so they will always know where you are and what you are saying.
Now, with the UK government seeking to not only surveil all economic transactions, but to actually take full control of every single citizen's paycheck, there are signs that the public may finally be being stirred into action. In recent years, data collected by European nations about their citizens are not being stored in national databases, but in vast regional databases, storing information on every citizen in Europe. Earlier this month, protesters gathered in Berlin to protest against growing state surveillance and intervention in EU citizens' lives.
This sort of mass demonstration would have been inconceivable merely 20 years ago, but of course, in 2 decades, our technologies have advanced hugely. Now, every single time you go on the internet, Your employer or your internet provider can trace what websites you have been to. Every single time you walk on the streets, you are being recorded by multiple CCTV cameras. Every single time you make a purchase, this financial information gets logged to your bank and once again to the authorities. What this requires is greater trust from the government. But of course, these people are saying you cannot trust the government, specifically because once information used to be kept by your national government, now increasingly it's being collected in Europe. In 2009, something called the Stockholm Programme was implemented. Make no mistake about it, this is a major change in the way that data is being collected about every citizen in the European Union. Instead of just being kept at the national level, it's now all going to be gathered at these huge European-wide databases. What these protesters want to know is why. Who's going to be accountable for how this information is used? There's no transparency about how this information is used. So they're saying that the European Union has no right to simply control all of its hundreds of millions of citizens.
In other news, one of the journalistic world's leading opponents of news censorship is, ironically enough, being censored for attempting to raise questions about 9/11. Dr. Peter Phillips and Mickey Huff, directors of the famed anti-censorship media watchdog group Project Censored, appeared on KPFA's Guns and Butter program last week to reveal how a so-called progressive think tank called the Institute for Policy Studies has rejected an op-ed piece that they were contracted to write for a publication called Minutemen Media on the grounds that they dared to include information indicating 9/11 was an inside job.
And so we mentioned the scientific studies done by Stephen Jones in the Open Chemical Physics Journal, and we included Richard Gage in the Architects and Engineers group, over 1,200 professionals now saying that the story, the official story, and the official quote-unquote science just doesn't make sense and doesn't add up. I mean, it defies what we know about scientific methodology and so forth. And so Peter and I included those examples, academic research pieces, fully noted. And, you know, I footnoted this piece, and it was 2 pages of footnotes for a 1.5-page article. So we were serious about it. And they literally told us that they were not going to publish anything that talked about 9/11. And we were dumbfounded. You know, at first we were waiting for the laugh tracks to come up and everything to be like, oh, we're censoring Project Censored. But no, they were deadly serious. They said, no, we're not going to run this, and we will not run anything on 9/11.
Although particularly ironic given that Project Censored has received numerous accolades for their role in decrying media censorship in the past, the fact that 9/11 Truth is being actively censored by establishment media outfits on both the left and the right sides of the phony left-right political paradigm will come as no surprise to longtime observers of the media. In the latest faux controversy about the uncontroversial idea that the US government has been covering up key information about 9/11, Iranian President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad's recent call for the UN to continue to probe the nature of the 9/11 attacks allowed BBC Persia to give Barry Soetoro a chance to express mock outrage over the idea of an independent investigation into those attacks.
President Obama had strong words today for Iranian President Ahmadinejad, who suggested in a speech at the United Nations yesterday that the U.S. government was behind the 9/11 attacks.
Well, it was offensive, it was hateful.
Especially, he said, because the comments were made not far from Ground Zero,
where families lost their loved ones, people of all faiths, all ethnicities. For him to make a statement like that was inexcusable.
As usual, the very media outlets that have fallen over themselves to report on the staged Obama-Ahmadinejad spat have failed to do any actual reporting on the issue, such as asking 9/11 victims' family members if they actually do question the official government investigation of those attacks.
I lost my son,
my nephew,
my uncle,
my son
on September 11th, 2001.
Most people don't know that a third tower fell on September 11th.
World Trade Center 7, a 47-story skyscraper, was not hit by a plane.
Although the official explanation is that fire brought down Building 7.
Over 1,200 architects and engineers have looked into the evidence
and believe there is more to the story.
Bring justice to my son,
my uncle,
my nephew,
my son,
and thousands of others who died on September 11th.
Go to buildingwhat.org.
Nor will the media actually bother to report on the published surveys that show that the vast majority of the public does indeed question the events of 9/11, including a 2004 Zogby poll showing 66% of New Yorkers want a new 9/11 investigation, and that half of New Yorkers believe that the government consciously failed to act on foreknowledge of the attacks. and a 2006 Angus Reid poll showing that over 70% of Americans believe the government is lying or hiding something about 9/11. Nor will the media bother to report on the former president of Italy's assertion that the attacks were planned and realized by the CIA and Mossad, the former German defense minister's book on the CIA in September 11th, or his subsequent remarks that the whole US government should end up behind bars, high-ranking Japanese government official Yukihisa Fujita presenting factual evidence about the impossibility of the official story of 9/11 on the floor of the Japanese Diet, or the American mayors, state representatives, councilors, policy analysts, and senior staff members who have signed on to a petition by the political leaders for 9/11 Truth, demanding a new investigation into the attacks. Nor will the establishment media ever report on the list of military professionals, lawyers, journalists, scientists, scholars, veterans, architects, engineers, pilots, or firefighters who question the official 9/11 narrative, as such reporting might undermine the official government media myth that there exists no mass movement of informed professionals who in any way doubt the idea that 9/11 can be unproblematically blamed on 19 devout Muslims who like to go to strip clubs, drink alcohol, and do drugs, and whose passports and personal memorabilia were impervious to fires that were, apparently, hot enough to weaken structural steel. Look for media-created hype over the Ahmadinejad comments to continue, even as so-called mainstream media outlets continue to lose readers, viewers, and listeners at record rates, and mass layoffs continue at media bastions like Newsweek, CNN, and ABC News. Finally this week, the Canadian government has launched a cover-up commission to not investigate the core issues surrounding the fact that government officials lied to the public about the scope and extent of supposedly secret laws that were passed in the run-up to this year's G20 event in Toronto. It was announced this week that the Ontario government had appointed former Ontario Chief Justice Roy McMurtry to head an examination of the Public Works Protection Act that was fraudulently used to deny Canadians of their rights under the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. The week after the G20 summit, Toronto Police Chief Bill Blair admitted that he had knowingly lied to the public about the laws governing the event. The day before the summit, numerous media outlets incorrectly reported that there was a 5-meter zone around the summit's perimeter fence in downtown Toronto that allowed police to violate Canadians' constitutional rights to freedom from unwarranted searches, and even that there was no limits to police powers in the so-called red zone. Now, instead of examining the larger issues of police provocateuring documented by numerous journalists at the event, the attacks on unarmed and peacefully assembled protesters throughout Toronto, the accusations that unlawfully detained protesters were sexually assaulted by police, or the issue of how and why the summit was held in downtown Toronto, or why it cost Canadian taxpayers $1 billion to host the summit, this new cover-up commission will solely focus on the implementation of the Public Works Act. Natalie DeRossis of the Canadian Civil Liberties Association pointed out that the review is inadequate to the scope of the problems raised at the G20, and that a full public inquiry at the federal level is needed to resolve all of the outstanding issues raised by the summit. I don't think we'll learn much about the G20 except that it was the occasion to use the Public Works Protection Act, a statute that nobody has heard much about, she told CBC News last week. Look for the review to conclude that lying to citizens and violating their constitutional rights was perfectly okay, and look for absolutely no government official to face any form of reprimand over the affair. Now please go to CorbettReport.com to download episode 148 of the Corbett Report, Media Kills, in which we examine the nexus between government, media, and public relations.